I even went so far as planning on setting up an altar with 10 different skulls and skeletons. It was my way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty. If I couldn't keep them there with me whole, I at least could keep their skeletons. On July 22nd, 1991, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards ran down a street in Milwaukee with a pair of handcuffs attached to one wrist. Edwards told the police that a Jeffrey Dahmer was trying to kill him. He explained how Dahmer had threatened to kill him and that he narrowly had escaped the killer. The police hesitantly followed Edwards back to Dahmer's apartment, not sure what to believe yet. Dahmer explained to the police that there had been a misunderstanding, and he almost managed to convince them. The police would have believed Dahmer if it wasn't for the fact that they spotted several Polaroid pictures in his apartment of dismembered bodies. They then arrested Jeffrey Dahmer, and his house of horrors was revealed. Everyone who knew Dahmer personally were shocked, as he'd always been a timid soul, yet behind the mask was the notorious cannibal killer. But who was Jeffrey Dahmer, and what factors played a role in him becoming a serial killer? In this episode of The Most Dangerous Animal of All, we take a look at the life of Jeffrey Dahmer, the cannibal killer. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on May 21, 1960, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His parents and relatives described Jeffrey as a happy toddler and child. This was until, at only 4 years old, Jeffrey was diagnosed with double hernia in his scrotum. Jeffrey's parents, particularly his father, explained that after the surgery, Jeffrey's behavior began to change. The surgery was something that caused Jeffrey extreme pain, and it was the first time his parents noticed something different with him. As Jeffrey continued to grow older, he became more and more distant, and after the birth of his younger brother, he completely withdrew from social interactions. His family moved around a lot, making it even harder for Jeffrey to form meaningful relationships. Once Jeffrey hit 14, his childhood took a darker turn. The combination of his parents' crumbling marriage due to his father's absence because of work and his mother's depression and suicide attempts caused Jeffrey to turn to other things in order to fill the empty voids in his life. His father, a research chemist, had taught Jeffrey at a young age how to use bleach on rodent corpses on animals that died under their home. This was meant to be a father-son bonding experience, an extension of a professional expertise from his father, but this eventually allowed for a dark interest to grow in Jeffrey. As time went on, Jeffrey's interest in dead animals grew. He would say that he was oddly thrilled by the sound of bones dropping in metal buckets. He began to collect dead animals. He would search for them in ditches, behind houses, along streets, anywhere he could find them. He would first dismember the animals behind his house in a woodshed, and then he would store them there. This dark fascination within Jeffrey grew, and he once even decapitated the corpse of a dog and nailed it to a tree. He began to kill animals, sometimes even putting their heads on sticks. He would burn cats alive, stone dogs, and cut off rabbits' heads, all for the thrill of it. This was only the start of Jeffrey Dahmer's dark fascination with the dead. When Jeffrey began school at Revere High School, life only became harder for him. While he had average grades and worked on the school newspaper, the situation at home with his parents was escalating even further. His parents were constantly fighting, his father absent for long periods of time, his mother falling deeper into depression. Jeffrey began to drink. His urge to drink grew, and it only got worse. He used drinking as a coping mechanism, as well as a way to suppress his urges. He never spoke to anyone about what was happening to him and the disturbing thoughts that he began to have in the back of his mind. At only 16, he began to fantasize about rape and violence. There was a jogger Jeffrey would see quite regularly, and he would fantasize about attacking the man and raping him. This did not stay a fantasy for long, and Jeffrey began to attempt on his feelings. One day after school, Jeffrey lay in wait for the jogger with a baseball bat. The jogger luckily did not come that day, and Jeffrey never attempted this again. It was clear that he wasn't suppressing his urges enough, and he began to drink even more to do so. This even concerned his fellow classmates that Jeffrey wasn't friends with. While Jeffrey was considered an outcast and a loner, his heavy drinking problem concerned even those who did not know him. Jeffrey would smuggle in beer and liquor to school inside the lining of his army fatigue jacket, allowing him to drink as much as he wanted to. As his drinking grew more extreme, his grades took a turn for the worse. And when Jeffrey turned 18, his parents finally got a divorce. The marriage counseling that his parents had tried had been unsuccessful, and his parents believed separating was the best option for everyone. His father, Lionel, moved out of the house and eventually married another woman. This was tough on Jeffrey, and not long after, he committed his first murder. Only a few weeks after Jeffrey graduated high school, he murdered 18-year-old Stephen Mark Hicks. Jeffrey managed to lure Stephen back to his house to hang out and have a few drinks before leaving for a rock concert. But Stephen met his demise that night. After his father moved out, his mother and younger brother eventually moved out as well. Jeffrey was living alone at his parents' house, and therefore he had the opportunity to lure Stephen back to an empty house. After a few hours together drinking and listening to music, Stephen was ready to leave, but Jeffrey did not want him to. Jeffrey struck Stephen in the head with a 10-pound dumbbell and strangled him to death. After that, Jeffrey did several things with Stephen's body before dissecting the dead body and burying it in a grave. His father soon visited Jeffrey after learning that his son was living alone. He convinced Jeffrey to go to college, and Jeffrey went to Ohio State University for 3 months before eventually dropping out. In 1979, his father again told Jeffrey to do something, and Dahmer joined the U.S. Army. Jeffrey worked as a combat medic in Germany, but due to his drinking problem was honorably discharged in March of 1981. Not soon after, 2 soldiers came forward about Dahmer raping them while in service. After his discharge, Jeffrey returned to Ohio. He was soon arrested for disorderly conduct. This caused Jeffrey's father to arrange for him to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin. However, his alcoholism only grew worse, and he was arrested again for indecent exposure. Jeffrey's adult life grew worse when he was repeatedly arrested and also put on trial for child molestation in May 1989. At this point, Jeffrey had already claimed 4 other victims at least. His second victim, Stephen Tuomi, he had no memory of even killing. He only remembered a night of heavy drinking, and when he woke up, he found Stephen's dead body next to him. His grandmother grew tired of Jeffrey's heavy drinking problems and late nights, but she had no knowledge of what other activities Jeffrey had been up to. In 1988, Jeffrey moved out of his grandmother's house due to her wishes. However, this did not stop Jeffrey's killing spree. After an encounter with a 13-year-old Laotian boy, he was once again arrested and charged for sexual exploitation and second-degree assault. This trial would be a turning point in his life. Dahmer argued for himself and explained how he saw the error in his ways, and he argued that he needed treatment. He received a year in prison, but on day release. This meant that Dahmer was able to go out and work during the day and return to the prison at night. Dahmer ended up only serving 10 months as the judge granted him early release for good behavior. After Jeffrey was released from prison, he moved back in with his grandmother briefly. But it became harder to hide what was happening and, more importantly, what Dahmer was doing to his victims. Because unlike most serial killers, Dahmer would hold on to the corpse of his victims' bodies because he didn't want to let go of them. Dahmer's fantasies included a series of crimes against the corpses of his victims, or what he referred to as passive sex. Dahmer eventually got a job as a mixer at Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, and he could finally afford a small apartment. So, on September 1988, he got a 1-bedroom apartment. This apartment would be where his murder spree worsened. He went from 4 victims to 17 in a matter of 2 years. He began to form serious rituals He would meet them first at a gay bar or a mall and entice them with free alcohol and money if they agreed to pose for photographs. He carefully selected victims on the outskirts of society in order to continue to remain invisible. Once Dahmer was alone with his victims, he would drug them, sometimes even torture them, and then kill them, usually by strangulation. Dahmer's fantasies grew worse when he began to experiment with the chemicals that he used as a child. He would use these chemicals to dissolve flesh and bones. Dahmer formed horrible habits. He began to perform lobotomies as well as injecting his victims with acid when they were still alive. He would keep parts of their body, including the skulls, which he would clean, much like he did with his childhood roadkill collection. Lastly, he began to refrigerate organs so he could eventually eat them. Dahmer was never fully satisfied. He thought, just one more victim and I'll be happy, but he never was, and he continued killing. Dahmer's murder spree continued uninterrupted until an incident on May 27, 1991. This was when his 13th victim, who was only 14 years old at the time, and also the younger brother of the boy Dahmer was convicted of molesting in 1989, was found wandering the streets nude and disoriented. When the police arrived at the scene, there were paramedics and two women who were standing close to the confused boy, as well as Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer had told the police that the boy was his 19-year-old lover who was drunk, and the two had had a quarrel. The police then escorted Dahmer and the boy back to Dahmer's apartment, much against the protest of the women who had witnessed the boy fighting off Dahmer before the police had arrived. They left the boy under Dahmer's care. What the police officers did not know was that night Jeffrey Dahmer killed the boy and performed his usual ritual on the body. In June and July of 1991, Dahmer's killing had escalated to one a week. This was until a fated July 2nd, when Dahmer's 18th victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. According to Edwards, Dahmer had tried to handcuff him, and the two had had a struggle. Edwards managed to escape, and he was spotted at around midnight by police, with handcuffs dangling from his wrist. After noticing the handcuffs on Edwards, the police tried to stop him, assuming that he had escaped. Edwards immediately told them about his encounter with Dahmer and then led him to his apartment. The police were surprised with how calmly Dahmer opened the door and answered their questions. Dahmer even agreed to turn over the key to unlock Edwards' handcuffs, and he moved to the bedroom to get it. When he moved, one of the officers went in with him, and as the officer glanced around Dahmer's room, he noticed Polaroid pictures. These were no ordinary Polaroid pictures. The officers then noticed the refrigerator filled with body parts and human skulls. They decided to place Dahmer under arrest, and they attempted to handcuff him. The once calm Dahmer changed, and he began to become aggressive and struggle and fight the police in order to get away. After the police had Dahmer under their control, they began their initial search of the apartment. As they searched his apartment, a house of horrors was revealed. The items that were found in Dahmer's apartment were truly horrific. In the apartment search, they discovered a human head and 3 bags of organs. This included 2 hearts, which were found in the refrigerator. They also uncovered 3 heads, a torso, various internal organs, as well as chemicals, such as ether and chloroform. They also discovered 2 more skulls, 2 hands, and male genitalia, which were in the closet. They uncovered bleach, which was used to bleach the skull and bones. Dahmer was arrested and sent to prison. At first, Dahmer was separated from the rest of the general population of the prison for his own safety. But Dahmer was considered a model prisoner who had adjusted well to prison life and was a self-proclaimed born-again Christian. He was then permitted to have some contact with other inmates. However, in the end, this did not go well for Dahmer. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer and another inmate were beaten to death by a fellow inmate while on a work detail in the prison gym. Jeffrey Dahmer ended up dying in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. At first, there was discussion between Jeffrey's mother and father about what to do with the body. In Dahmer's will, he had requested upon his death that his body would be cremated, But there were several medical researchers who wanted to research Dahmer's brain. His father, Lionel, believed that his son's wishes should be fulfilled, while his mother felt that his brain should go to research. They were actually able to study Dahmer's brain for a year, and they discovered that there was nothing abnormal with Dahmer's brain, and that he was not necessarily born to kill, biologically speaking. Jeffrey Dahmer is an example of a serial killer who had a traumatic childhood, formed patterns and serial killer signatures that can be linked to his childhood, and got both psychological and sexual gratification from his crimes.
To this day, I don't know what started it. And the person to blame is sitting right across from you. That's the only person. Not parents, not society, not pornography. I mean, those are just excuses.
He wanted to control his victims and make sure they could never leave. As a child, he was a loner and an outcast, and his serial killer patterns reflect how he wanted to make sure he was never alone again.
I had these obsessive desires and thoughts wanting to control them, to, I don't know how to put it, possess them permanently.
And that's why you killed them?
Right. Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me. And as my obsession grew, I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
To conclude, looking at Jeffrey Dahmer, there were several factors that played a role in his formation as a serial killer. He said himself,
"It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. When you depersonalize another person and view them as just an object for pleasure instead of a living, breathing human being, it seems to make it easier to do things you shouldn't do."
The psychology behind Dahmer is complex, and it is clear that Dahmer was a troubled, disturbed individual, and he was also someone who had a traumatic childhood, who began to develop disturbing habits to deal with the urges he was feeling, as well as form patterns based on these things. Jeffrey Dahmer struggled with the dark part of himself for many years, until finally giving in to the evil, and Dahmer left a legacy of pain and trauma on the city of Milwaukee, and it will take the city a long time to heal.